Afternoon, good morning, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us from across the globe. And thank you for being with us today. We'll wait a couple of more minutes for other participants to join, so please bear with us. Good. So I think we are good to start. Welcome everyone again for also for those that have just joined. My name is Rose Washington. I'm a program officer at IUCN and the coordinator of the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation FEBA network. It is a privilege to welcome you to the second session of our Every Loss Matters webinar series. This webinar is organized by the PEDRR FEBA Joint Working Group on Loss and Damage, which is co-chaired by UNU EHS and UNEP. In our first session back in February, we laid the groundwork by introducing Frame Echo, a powerful framework that offers a practical pathway for countries to identify and track the biodiversity and ecosystem-related losses. Despite progress being made and ecosystem-based approaches advancing, they still remain underrepresented in key loss and damage mechanisms, highlighting a critical opportunity to scale action. So against this backdrop, today's webinar focuses on transformative and innovative approaches to responding to biodiversity and ecosystem losses. The session will highlight global frameworks, practical experiences, and lessons learned, with a particular focus on how NBS and EBA approaches are proving effective where challenges persist. So as today's title suggests, today we are moving from lessons to action. We have designed today's discussion as a journey, starting with a global policy landscape, then diving into field-based evidence and concluding with how international systems can offer a pathway in protecting the most vulnerable. We are joined by three extraordinary speakers today who represent the full spectrum of this work. Dr. Neil Adrian Malari, who brings the vital perspective of frontline action and the GAF framework from the Philippines. Julia Rocha Romero, who will help us understand the technical and research-backed pathways to scaling these solutions. And Dr. Elisa Cagliari, who sits at the heart of WIM-XCOM, helping to shape the very architecture for loss and damage. Before we dive into our panel discussion today, we would love to understand who is with us in the room today. I'll hand over to my colleague Hannah for a quick Mentimeter poll to see where you are joining us from and what you hope to take away from today's discussion. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to meet you. Good morning, afternoon. My name is Hannah Cook. I'm the IUCN FEBA intern helping to organize this webinar series. So on the screen, hopefully everyone should be able to see, we're going to start with a quick Mentimeter where all should be able to join through menti.com. The code is on the screen, but it's 11975153. And we're going to begin briefly by understanding where is everyone based to see where people are calling in from all around the world. It's great. It looks like we've got some great diversity here today, which is great. We'll move on to the next slide, but do please continue to submit. We'd love to hear where you're from. So we're next going to move on to what are your main areas of interest. So hearing about what kind of field you work in. Do you work in loss and damage, tangential loss and damage, what your specific interests are in your work. We'd love to see who we have represented today. Biodiversity, methodology, EBA. That's great. That's great. Looks like we have a lot of people that work in loss and damage or close to loss and damage, EB and NBS, which is great. This will be a great audience for today. I think we'll speak to a lot of these topics. We'll move on to the next slide. Please do continue to submit responses. Finally, we'd like to conclude by going over what are your expected outcomes from today's webinar? What are you hoping to gain? So our options for this are gain insights into practical experiences and best practices for addressing loss and damage, understand how nature-based solutions and other innovative approaches can avert, minimize, and respond to losses, and identify opportunities to embed ecosystem action within national and international loss and damage policies. And then also, if you have any other objectives that you would like to get out of today's webinar, please feel free to add them into the Q&A or chat box, because we would love to hear anything else that you would like to be addressed today. Great. It seems like we have a lot of interest in understanding how to embed EBA into national loss and damage policies, as well as the role that EB and NBS can play in minimizing and averting losses. That'll be a very relevant topic to today. So glad to hear that our interests are aligned. So great. I will keep the Mentimeter open, so please feel free to continue to add to it, as it should remain open. But we can move back on. I will transfer it back over to you, Rose. We can come back over here to the presentation. It was very nice to meet everyone. And please message if you need anything. Thank you. Back to you, Rose.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you for everyone for sharing. Also very pleased to see that there's such a strong interest in today's discussion. So, and hopefully in today's conversation, we will offer answers to some of your questions. So before we dive into the discussion, I'm delighted to introduce three excellent experts joining us today. As I mentioned before, they represent the full spectrum of action, from high-level global policy to technical research and frontline community implementation. I'm going to start the other way around. So we'll start with Dr. Elisa Cagliari, who joins us as the co-chair of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, WIM-EXCOM. In this role, Elisa is at the center of shaping the global policy agenda on loss of damage under the UNFCCC. She's also a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and a scientist at the CMCC Foundation in Venice. Elisa has contributed to a wide range of international initiatives, including adaptation and DRR projects across Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America, as well as Africa. Welcome, Elisa. Next, representing the frontline perspective from the Philippines is Dr. Neil Aldrin Malari. Aldrin is the president and co-founder of the Center for Conservation Innovations, CCIPH. With more than 3 decades of experience, he is widely recognized for translating technical environmental science into practical action, supporting practitioners to avert, minimize, and address biodiversity and ecosystem-related losses, including climate and disaster-related losses. And finally, we have Julia Rocha Romero, a nature-based solutions advisor at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, UNEP CCC. Julia works in the adaptation section, advancing climate resilience and implementation at the national and subnational levels. Her work focuses on supporting countries in implementing NBS into climate policy and planning, particularly for adaptation, ecosystem resilience, and addressing climate-related loss and damage. So, very warm welcome to our distinguished panelists today. And with our panel now introduced, let's begin our journey from global policy to local action. Elisa, let's start with the global view. The WIM XCOM has been instrumental in advancing knowledge on biodiversity-related loss and damage. From WIM's perspective, how is ecosystem loss currently being addressed, and where do you see the most critical gaps, particularly regarding the role of ecosystems in recovery and reconstruction?
Yeah, thank you, Rose, for this question, and thanks also for guiding us through the discussion today. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm really looking forward to learn from Aldrin and Julia, as well as from all the participants that, as we could see, are scattered across the globe. So many different perspectives that I'm really eager to learn from. As you said, Rose, I'm actually co-chairing the XCOM. But I'm going to speak today in my personal capacity as a researcher that has worked a bit, only a slightly bit on NBS. But I'm also happy, of course, to offer my perspective as a privileged observers of these international climate negotiations. Before delving maybe into the work that we do within the XCOM, I just wanted to briefly remind the audience of what the WIM is and what we are supposed to do. As you might recall, the WIM was established back in 2013 with 3 key functions. The first one is to advance knowledge and understanding around loss and damage. The second is to strengthen coordination and coherence among the different stakeholders that work in this space. And the third one is around action and support to address loss and damage. And back in 2013, the XCOM was established to guide the implementation of this function. And we work through work plans. Now we have a 5-year rolling work plan, which we implement through the support of different expert groups. Currently, we have 5 thematic expert groups. One is the task force on displacement, that we have the expert group on climate risk management, the one working on slow onset event, the expert group on action and support, and the expert group on non-economic losses. It's really within these last expert groups, so the one on which we call NELS, non-economic losses, that work on biodiversity and ecosystem services is happening. And among other things, because as you know, NELS is a pretty broad category. So the expert group not only deals with issues related to biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also with the topic of health, impact on cultural heritage, mobility, and so on. The expert group came up with a plan of action for 2025 to 2027, which we approved at the latest XCOM back in September 2025. And there are a couple of activities that specifically speaks to biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the first one is about a knowledge product that the group will produce on methodologies for assessing loss and damage related to biodiversity and ecosystem services, which will be led by UNU EHS, UNDRR, and UNEP. But it's not just about working on methodologies, which is actually something that we're trying to do across different expert groups, because some feedback that we got from countries was that currently there are very little tools that support policymakers to actually assess the nature and the extent of loss and damage on the ground. So this is a cross-cutting effort across expert group, but specifically in the NELS expert group, work on methodologies will center around ecosystem services and biodiversity. And it's a methodological work, but the ambition is then to champion this approach with countries. And the second activity that the expert group is undertaking is actually related to the fantastic job of the organizer of these seminars. So the idea is to link with FEBA and PEDRR to, again, better understand and promote the role of ecosystems-based approaches and nature-based solutions, but also, again, to strengthen the integration of these approaches into policymaking and decision-making. And I have to say that compared to the plan of action that the expert group has had before, which ran between 2021 to 2025, now there's a much stronger focus on ecosystem services, NBS, and biodiversity loss. And this is, of course, a very good news. And just to give you an idea of this strengthened attention that we're giving within the work of the EXCOM, next week we will be having our 24th meeting, and we have a standing agenda item on science. And within this agenda item, we will explicitly discuss about ecosystem-based approach to loss and damage. Rose, you also asked me about where I see some gaps. I'm not sure I would call them gaps, but maybe there are some areas where we could further strengthen our attention and work. And one of these is maybe trying to better understand how ecosystem-based approaches work in the ex-post phase of a disaster. My feeling is that, and with good reasons, we have been focusing our reflections and our work on the prevention phase, especially when we think about DRR on adaptation, we are working a bit ex ante, but loss and damage encompasses the full spectrum. So what we need to do before a disaster strike, but also what we do after we are faced with very severe consequences of different types of events. And so I think it's something that maybe we would be interested in further exploring in the EXCOM is the role of ecosystem-based approaches when it comes, for example, to recovery or reconstruction. And maybe Aldrin and Julia have some experiences to share, and I'm really looking forward to their contribution. So this is more in terms of the conceptual or approaches gaps or challenges that I see. And maybe just to share with you a last one from a negotiation perspective, what I noted is that that there's a lot of discussions going on, especially when it comes to nature-based solutions in the adaptation track. Well, when we deal with this type of topics in the loss and damage track, discussions are not happening to the same extent. So, sometimes negotiations work a bit in silos. So I think there are opportunities to try to, break this silence and try to be a bit more consistent and learn from what is happening also in other discussion under UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So this is more of a call for us involved in the process to try to reach out to colleagues and try to, synergize the work that we do within our respective mandates. Yes, so maybe I would stop it here with these initial reflections and give the floor back to you, Rose, and looking forward to the contributions by my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for these for your insightful contribution, and also for providing an insight into the work at BIM and some of the potential opportunities that you just outlined. Aldrin, now I would like to hand over to you. So you've spent over 30 years translating science into action. At CCIPH, you pioneered the Green Assessment and Recovery Framework, GAF, to strengthen post-disaster assessments. Could you share how CCIPH has used GAF-informed action to minimize and address losses of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and some of the practical steps that can inform the practice?
Thanks,
Over
Rose.
to you.
Good evening and good day to everyone in this webinar. Let me try to answer that, Rose, by presenting a bit of context of, the difficulties and the situation that we have in the Philippines before I attempt to answer and to share my experience or our experience. First is that the Philippines prioritizes adaptation over mitigation in its climate change budget, for example, allocating just 2.6% of the government spending on mitigation efforts. Only 2.6%. The second is the Philippines faces frequent natural disasters with around 20 typhoons each year. Intensifying extreme weather events or extreme weather is accelerating biodiversity loss and damaging ecosystems, which undermines community resilience. However, recovery measures often fail to address biodiversity, ecosystem integrity, and often gender issues that come along with it. The third context is that there's a common misconception that only government or the Department of Environment and Natural Resources that oversees biodiversity management. But in reality, many state and non-state actors are really involved. So weak coordination and compartmentalization or compartmentalized planning, this hinder effective disaster response and resource management nationwide. While significant funds go to disaster relief, investment in ecosystem restoration remain very limited. But if we analyze it, and based on our studies, this in fact could enhance resilience and lower overall costs. I'll talk about that later on. So let's glean from our experience. Following Super Typhoon Rai, or this is a Category 5 Super Typhoon in December 2021. After that, we initiated and piloted the Green Assessment and Recovery Framework, or we call GARF. This framework is designed to identify areas at risks or sources of risk, enabling targeted responses that address the vulnerability of communities reliant on ecosystems and ecosystem services, not just the infrastructure. But as you know, both of these, meaning ecosystems and communities, are susceptible to extreme weather events. The GARF employs 2 assessment stages and 1 recovery stage. The first stage functions as a triage, as it uses remote sensing technology to quickly assess or for quick assessment, identifying damage, defining target areas or area of interest, and setting response priorities. This process helps choose the ground validation or choose sites for ground validation, and this makes the ground validation more efficient. So, as I said, it works as a triage. Then the second step or second stage that we use in GARF involves ground surveys to validate the stage 1 results. We use drones, and drones collected training data for calibrating satellite imagery, producing detailed maps depicting the 6 IPCC land cover types and changes pre and post disaster. We did systematic biodiversity surveys. Scientists and citizen scientists collaborated in producing distribution or species distribution maps and ecosystem condition validation. Focus groups and community dialogues assess damage to livelihoods and resources. If you're interested, I mean, in one of the landscapes that we were working, 60% of the forest in that locality was destroyed because of the typhoon. And this covers, the area of interest covers about 500,000 hectares. And 60% of the forest was obliterated because of that single event. 50% of the mangroves were destroyed as well. And 100% of the plantations where communities depend was also damaged. In another locality, almost close to 50% of the corals was also destroyed because of wave action. So um, the biophysical data from this analysis informed our stage 3, the final stage of the GARF, where inclusive green recovery plans are created based on the scale and severity of the damage. Our experience in GARF underscores the critical importance of integrating comprehensive biodiversity metrics with satellite-based assessments of ecosystem damage to enhance non-economic loss and damage reporting. By advancing the beyond basic, area-based evaluations towards detailed analysis of ecological impacts, it becomes possible to identify species and habitats most at risk, facilitating targeted conservation strategies. Systematic recording of population or species population changes, habitat suitability or shifts in habitat suitability, and landscape connectivity establishes a reliable framework for transparent comparison across various disturbance events and regions, thereby supporting informed decisions on refuge protection, for example, or development of corridor restoration and recovery planning. In other words, the data that we generated from the green assessment and the green assessments that we've done using the most, as we say, sophisticated science available to us, enable government to really assess the real condition, the non-economic condition of the landscape and seascape post disaster. Because prior to 2021, prior to Typhoon Rai, most PEDRR, post-disaster needs assessment, was focused on economic values, and therefore, you know, the Build Back Better framework is all about bringing back, revitalizing economic activities pre-disaster or post-disaster. So I think those are the lessons that we've learned beyond those rhetorics about mitigation or debates on mitigation and adaptation. The Philippines is under clear and present danger, and all of these extreme weather events are happening very, very often. In fact, last October we had 6 all in the span of 2 weeks, 6 super typhoons happening in the north and in the south, happening one after the other in just 1 week. If you glean back on what the impacts and the cost of the Typhoon Rai, for example, it has isolated a lot of the suitable habitats of many threatened species within many of these landscapes. So does that make sense? I mean, that seems to be a whistle-stop sort of tour of what we've done using GARF. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aldrin, for sharing insights into the context of the Philippines and the implementation of the GARF. Really fascinating to see how powerful this integrated science-backed tool can be in practically bridging the gap between environmental protection and humanitarian recovery, especially in such a challenging context as the Philippines at the moment. I'd like to turn to Julia now to share a bit more about her experience at UNEP CCC. Julia, what does the evidence tell us about the effectiveness of NBS in addressing irreversible ecosystem losses? And more importantly, as countries look to apply these tools, where are the biggest knowledge gaps and capacity gaps in assessing and responding to biodiversity-related loss and damage we still need to overcome? Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Rose, and thanks again, colleagues from PEDRR and FEBA, for the invitation to join such a relevant and interesting panel and be also joined by such experts as Elisa and Aldrin. I'm really happy to be here. And I appreciate the question as well. It's not an easy answer, and it's actually, as we all know, a quite complex question when we look into what can NBS do and what are the limits of nature-based solutions or the effectiveness in haltering or in addressing irreversible ecosystem losses. So I'll try to be comprehensive in my answer, but I really look forward to the conversation with my fellow panelists as well. We know that the IPCC tells us about the feasibility or the feasible effect of adaptation when it comes to nature-based solutions, and this is a topic that is constantly under discussion and under scrutiny of future and ongoing research. But what we understand is that nature-based solutions is a feasible and effective adaptation strategy, particularly when we look at the options that combine nature-based solutions to both reduce risks. So what Aldrin was talking about, looking at how nature-based solutions can come in before shocks, not necessarily just after shocks. And also how ecosystem-based adaptation with nature-based solutions can do that while addressing a lot of what we call co-benefits. So both to supporting biodiversity and ecosystem service, but also very much looking into the well-being of local communities. At UNEP, we have a very strong focus on looking into how ecosystem-based adaptation can continue to support countries' adaptation efforts, and also increasingly so in the loss and damage sphere. There's over 50 projects that have exactly this mandate within member states to support their strategies and ability to plan. And plan here, I'm talking about not just develop frameworks that never get used, but really to roll out a feasible implementation for collecting better data, having robust institutional arrangements to facilitate this data gathering and monitoring related to the linkage between nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, and loss and damage. This being said, we have to also take a step back and understand that the evidence, although the evidence of course points that nature-based solution is a very effective method for both rehabilitating areas that have experienced a climate shock to some degree, and also a very robust strategies to prevent damages, their effectiveness is not unlimited. And of course, there is no single recipe that we can come up and say, for example, Aldrin gave the example of the typhoon. It's a very strong magnitude, but we obviously are aware that nature-based solutions can be a very robust strategy to a certain degree, and it has to also be combined with different types of measures. For me, and across our work at the UNEP CCC, we see that nature-based solutions is not necessarily a substitute for working with loss and damage with national counterparts, and again, looking very much into the national needs for capacity, which I'll get back to in a second. But they are part of a continuum. And what do I mean here when I'm speaking about continuum? So we're talking about the entire setup where countries and communities will experience climate shock. So nature-based solution can come both before a certain impact, so to minimize the extent and the first blunt of that impact, as well as in the restoration and rehabilitation phase. Very much complementing the support that countries are needing to receive on developing methodologies, developing metric systems to quantify and assess the types of losses and damages. And Elisa has already mentioned the NELD component, so the non-economic loss and damage that usually falls through the crack, and that's exactly where biodiversity loss falls through the crack. Ecosystem services are usually unseen and uncaptured by common frameworks. And this is highly problematic, obviously, because these items are not siloed. They're part of an economy. They're part of nature services to communities. They represent, in the end of the day, economic losses as well. As an example, we work in Zambia, and Zambia is hosting the Loss and Damage Advisory Board meeting this week. And Zambia is a very interesting case because it's there we can really see that the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem impacts related to climate change. So, for example, the big drought they've been experiencing over the last year has a direct effect on the loss of tourism for people and tourists from all over the region and the world that come to visit the Victoria Falls. Tourism now is one of the main drivers of the country's economy. A lot of people travel to see the Victoria Falls. It's one of the 7 wonders of the world. And now I'm wondering if they have been expanded to 8. So apologies if I don't recall. But it has an impact beyond what, of course, the impacts that the local community feels, the loss of endemic species that have their own intrinsic value. So now going back to the gap when it comes to capacity, this is a really big question. And what we understand are the biggest gaps is going back to what my point was on data, the ability to quantify, understand where data is not being captured. And that's usually happening at the local level. There's a lot of local experiences to climate change when it comes to loss and damage that are not captured in normal frameworks. So data from local communities, data related to women's experiences. Again, going back to the NELD component, there's a lot of data corners, so to speak, unlit corners. And this doesn't help with another gap, which is a lack or not a robust enough institutional arrangement for addressing loss and damage, which again is very connected to nature-based solutions as well. Without having a significant mandate, it's very hard for national and subnational institutions to be able to address loss and damage and to plan for nature-based solutions as a strategy to rehabilitate an area after a certain event. If they don't have the mandate to do so, the budget allocation to do so, the trained staff, and here I'm saying trained staff because it is a segue to the capacity gap as well. There's a strong focus on disaster risk reduction in some areas, and a lot of resources are mobilized after an event happened, but not a lot before and on the planning side for that. So I'll leave you with these 3 main gaps. So to recap, the capacity gap capacity in general related to loss and damage, the institutional arrangement gap, and the data gap. So, and they're obviously interconnected and impact one another positively in that sense that it's negatively. I hope this covers it, although, as I mentioned, it really isn't an easy question to answer, but although it's a very interesting one, and I think that for us practitioners, and Aldrin shared a very relevant experience from the Philippines, and Elisa is obviously speaking to what's happening at a global level, it's equally important that we understand the limitations of nature-based solution, but also where it can make a difference. I'll stop here for now and hand it over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for reaffirming, on the one hand, the effectiveness of NBS in rehabilitation and prevention of climate shocks, but for also uncovering some of the constraints that come along with the implementation of NBS solutions, as you mentioned, in terms of capacity, institutional arrangements, and also the data gap. So Julia's point about the capacity gap also leads us back to the reality of implementation. Even when the evidence is there, the path to action is rarely a straight line. With this, I'd like to turn back to Aldrin. Can you please share a case where NBS helped address loss and damage where traditional adaptation or disaster risk reduction approaches fell short? And then a second question is then, in those cases, were the barriers to sustaining these ecosystem-based approaches primarily financial, or are we dealing with deeper institutional and socio-cultural hurdles? Over to you, Aldrin.
Thank you, Rose. Again, as Julia and Elisa said, the questions are, so loaded. I'll attempt to answer this by, again, telling a story about our experience. The case study that I presented, the GARF, the Green Assessment and Recovery Framework, effectively highlighted the framework's potential to enhance post-disaster response. And that's a fact. Not only that, it also helped enhance rehabilitation, the thinking around rehabilitation and restoration efforts in the Philippines. It is anticipated that future post-disaster response and recovery initiatives will leverage with the Green Assessment Recovery Framework, we think, transitioning from the traditional disaster risk reduction, or DRR, to ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, or eco-DRR, and hopefully towards the path to eco-resilience strategies, not just build back better, meaning just building back or rebuilding bridges or houses stronger, but looking at an eco-resilience strategy or pathway. Efforts are currently underway to demonstrate eco-DRR at the site level. For instance, in Palawan, following Typhoon Rai, one of the islands that was hit, national government agencies, local government, civil society organizations, and communities have collaborated or collaboratively developed green recovery plans. These include protection, rehabilitation, restoration, assisted natural regeneration, or spontaneous regeneration, alongside corresponding fund or resource mobilization strategies. And notably, 10% of the needed budget for the Green Recovery Plan has been secured by local governments through their internal revenue allotment. And that's a huge thing, with additional resources being pursued through private sector partnership to address the remaining funding gaps. Oh, by the way, the magnitude of the loss in terms of forest ecosystem, 125,000 hectares was destroyed, and that was and the objective of the Green Recovery Plan is to restore the damage 125,000 hectares and to protect the 90,000 hectares of forest that remains. So, recognizing the value of the Green Assessment Recovery Framework, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR, has actively integrated the framework into the training programs, into their policy development as well. So DNR are Environment Ministry has taken on GARF, which to us is a success. Approximately to date, more than 200 DNR regional and field office staff have received training from us in various shapes or stages of the framework or framework implementation or the GARF implementation. Nevertheless, the capacity to deliver cross-sectoral inclusive GARF remains inconsistent across the Philippines and is limited with respect to policy guidance, management standards, funding, staffing, and technical expertise. Because the Philippines is a lot of the government functions were devolved to local governments. And so we are a country of more than 7,000 islands, and each municipality is it's almost autonomous. So, you know, how do you say that? Getting get getting the GARF to scale would be difficult. Up until now, or up, we've only reached about more than 200 DNR staff. There are about 5,000 or 10,000 staff. So much work has to be done. And despite the progress within DNR, several challenges still persist. And I'll outline the 4 challenges following Julia's example. First challenge is developing inclusive green recovery plans at the site level. As I said, every month or every year we have at least 20 typhoons, and often the impacts um, are felt at the site's level. What needs to be done is that each of at the site level, green recovery plans um, should be crafted, but crafted alongside communities. Because often after every typhoon, the problem is we are business as usual. We tend to forget, typhoon. As soon as electricity, communication, road systems are back online, we tend to forget, and we go back to business as usual without understanding that, hang on, your ecosystem and ecosystem services have been compromised because of that previous storm. The second challenge is establishing mechanisms for participatory decision making that ensure balanced representation of women and marginalized groups. Because DRR, unfortunately, is a man's world in the Philippines. Um, we fail to remember and we fail to understand that women has that inherent nurturing capacity, and most of our laws are crafted by men, and therefore there's that um, dissonance, if you like, and we need to establish these mechanisms so that the participatory mechanism decision making um, can ensure balanced representation of women, and especially marginalized groups. Often indigenous peoples are not part of the decision making. The third challenge is enhancing the capacity of first responders and local DRRM units in utilizing or using the GARF. We've only trained DNR personnel, and a lot of the first responders are from the local governments, and that needs to be done as well. And lastly, um, we need to foster strong public support for the GARF. Um, at the moment, there is a disconnect between people and nature, and that there's always this false dichotomy that nature is something that's outside, and in post disaster needs assessment, nature doesn't figure in the post disaster needs assessment. It's always anything that is related to economics. Anything that's non-economic, it's in the back burners. So this is an opportunity and also a challenge that we change the narrative, we change the storytellers, and we change the paradigm, if you like, that if nature is not okay, our nation and our people will not be okay too. Thanks, Rose.
Thank you, Aldrin, for this powerful example and for highlighting some of the challenges faced in the implementation of the GAR in the Philippines. Julia, building on some of the challenges that Aldrin just outlined, what role can research and technical institutions play in supporting countries in moving past project implementation and scale and operationalize ecosystem-focused loss and damage response?
Thanks, Rose. Yeah, and thanks, Aldrin, for a lot of extremely relevant points. I'd like to highlight two specific points that Aldrin brought here that I believe are very relevant to discuss when we're thinking about the role of research and technical institutions, both national, but also those that come into the country to provide support when we're talking about looking into ecosystem-based adaptation or ecosystem-focused loss and damage responses. So Aldrin already mentioned this, but I think research and technical institutions have a key role to play in challenging short-termism when it comes to planning for a robust loss and damage response. And this also mirrors what I was talking before. So having a full grasp of when and how nature can be strengthened as a way to secure, that losses and damages are minimized to some extent. And it's understandable that for many countries and in many contexts, you may not have that kind of robust planning, which means that you are forced to just plan on the short term. It's everything. It's go, go, go. There's not a certain pipeline. Here I'm talking about financial pipeline, but human resources pipeline, in general, a programmatic pipeline that can support that kind of planning that is robust and cohesive and also sustainable across a different or a longer time span. But research and technical institutions can support tackling that perspective and showing the benefits of going in first and front-loading action to protect nature. There's a lot of science that doesn't leave academic institutions. There's a lot of knowledge that doesn't get absorbed at the local level, and not just absorbed, because I also want to highlight that there is a lot of knowledge within local institutions, within local academia, within local communities that doesn't get utilized. Sometimes that knowledge comes in from us, from the outsiders, and that's all good and fine, but it's not always a context relevant, and it doesn't have that context flavor that only national institutions and national academia, think tanks, research centers, local communities can provide in their own language within their own context. So that's really powerful. And I think that research institutions have a strong role to play there, local institutions as well. The other point, I'll come back to that. I think I'll make that my last point. But the second point that builds on this is, supporting the translation of science into practical tools, into things that can be applied. So allowing for the research and that knowledge, whether that came from the outside or from the country itself or both, to actually materialize into practical tools, practical frameworks, steps, guidances, things that can be successfully mainstreamed into what I was mentioning before on the institutional arrangements and things like that. So for us, I think it's relevant to understand that countries don't need more reports. And very elusive methodologies. They need something that's concrete and validated when it comes to local indicators, local scenarios, planning tools that are context specific enough that can be used by ministries, by city halls, by local government, etc. So at UNEP CCC, we pay a lot of attention to this specific point, to have the supporting, to develop tools and methodologies that have been fully validated at the national and subnational level. So here I'm speaking about baseline assessments, climate vulnerability profiling that is, granular enough, that's painting a whole of society image, because if you don't have that, then you already have a very incomplete data set. And also, we also do the same for establishing a loss and damage future estimation based on climate projections, and from that on, developing adaptation scenarios that support or that mainstream nature into the equation. So all of these steps, all the way that lead up all the way to reporting, and perhaps if the country would like and is going to, all the way up to how they would try to achieve funding from, for example, the funding on loss and damage. All of these steps need to be validated with institutions, and they start with science. So science that has been translated into practical tools and methodologies. I also think that a big way that research and technical institutions can be a stronger asset is for supporting the connection of existing fragmented agendas. And I mentioned this also before. There's a lot of siloed approaches, mandates that sometimes are contradicting, sometimes not, but often competing for resources. And often these resources are already scarce. So it's not that there's enough for everybody. They are already scarce, so institutions have to compete for that. And science can really come in, and of course, research institutions and us providing technical support in connecting these fragmented agendas. That's not to say that that's an easy job, and that's not to say that we often get it done, but it's an important step to have in mind, so that that whatever support is being given can yield tangible results. We know that loss and damage, and ecosystem-focused loss and damage in particular, sits at this intersection between adaptation, biodiversity, DRR, and development. So that's why it needs to be very much connected, so that we're not duplicating efforts, overspending, or worse, creating more issues, which it's a big topic. I won't go into that, but if you just use nature and also start planting, for example, a bunch of non-endemic species, and you're not considering all the science that goes into it, and you're not having the most robust or accurate climate data projection, you will end up creating more problem than you already had in the beginning. So that's something to think as well. And I'll end with another point that I think Aldrin mentioned in his response before, and I took note of that, which is helping on the financial side. So us as technical institutions coming from the outside, and as I mentioned, also from in countries as well, we have a big role to play in developing or identifying ways that finance can be supported, ensuring that there's PPPs, or ensuring that the private sector understands the value added of coming in with investments and coming in with funds that can, either be seedling funds to support the existing efforts that the national budgets are already pulling, or developing full-on new pipelines for this kind of funding. Making that case is very difficult, and this is where we can easily come in, and this is where I believe we should be coming in to identify pipelines for supporting loss and damage funding when it comes to nature-based solutions. I will leave you with these three main ones, but happy to expand if something was unclear. But yeah, there are probably a lot of more steps, but these are the ones that speak the most to me and in my work at UNEP CCC. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for unpacking the role of research and technical institutions in supporting countries to scale and operationalize ecosystem-focused loss and damage responses. We'll now circle back to the global architecture to close our discussion today. Today, we've heard about practical tools, evidence, and local realities. Elisa, how can the WIM, the Santiago Network, and the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage ensure that support actually reaches the most vulnerable groups, especially indigenous peoples and rural communities who are most reliant on ecosystems? Over to you, Elisa.
Yeah, thank you, Rose, for this question. As you mentioned, the loss and damage support system has these three key components: the EXCON, the Santiago Network, and the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And what I think it's very special about this support system is that institutionally it embeds a direct support to communities and vulnerable groups. So the ambition of this support landscape is really to move beyond the national level and try to reach those who are at the front lines of climate impacts. And just to make this more concrete, you mentioned the Santiago Network. And if you take the decisions that establish and operationalize it, you will see that one of the key things that it aims to do is to make sure that technical assistance, which is funded by the network, is made available directly to the communities through some level of minimum percentage of technical assistance that needs to be devoted specifically to this aim. And what the advisory board of the Santiago Network will do when they will meet next September for their second meeting of the year is really to come up with a number for this percentage to make sure that funds are allocated and can be directly used for community support. And pretty much the same philosophy applies to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. One thing that was made very clear since its establishment is that it needs to be something different from the funds which are already out there. And really it's based on a bottom-up and country-led or philosophy. So countries need to come up with the approaches that work best for them, for the local realities. And there's a specific access modality which is called the small grants that specifically aims at supporting communities, also indigenous people and other vulnerable groups to respond to loss and damage. So the institutional landscape was somehow created to make sure that this link with the ground, the actual ground, is made. And what does this mean when it comes to ecosystem-based approaches, which is one specific element that the loss and damage support system embeds? So I think that, first of all, there's a role for the EXCOM to start with, in the sense that our aim is really to mainstream ecosystem-based approaches into loss and damage policy, guidance, and national frameworks. And maybe by doing so, we can ensure that what Julia was referring to, so these capacity gaps and institutional gaps, starts to be somehow filled. And of course, when we provide this guidance, it's also about keeping communities and vulnerable group at the forefront of our framing. So this is somehow the policy work that we need to do. But then this more policy and guidance work can be translated into action through the Santiago Network. So there you have the resources to provide technical assistance, as I said, directly to communities to design and implement these approaches. And then the fund can also come with financial resources to make sure that these approaches are actually carried out and they are scaled up. So, of course, nothing, I guess we're not perfect. We're trying to design an architecture that can somehow meet the challenge ahead. As you know, the fund is in its startup phase, so there's a lot still to learn in the process. But I guess that, what at the international level parties, so states, can do is try to create this enabling institutional framework that can deliver on the ground. But then at the at the national level and the local level, we really need the practitioners, and we need, as Julia said, the research institute and another organization that can actually support local authorities, can support communities in shaping these bottom-up responses that can be actually supported through the Santiago network and the fund. So that there's a need really to work possibly together, but at different levels, to make sure that we can also deliver on the ground. So we send the signal at the international level, but then this needs to be implemented also by other actors. And yes, I would I will stop it here and maybe give the floor back to you, Rose, for any other question, also for hearing from our participants.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much as well for connecting the dots and really highlighting this whole of society approach as it alludes to. This is also an opportunity now for us to wrap up the panel discussion and hear from the participants here joining us online. Before we dive into the Q&A section of today, I'd like to just very briefly summarize what we've discussed today. So today we've moved from the high-level architecture of the WIM to the practical implementation of GARD in the Philippines and back into the global evidence base and the role of research and technical institutions in advancing ecosystem-focused loss and damage. We will now open the floor for the Q&A session and any questions you may have for the speakers. There is a Q&A, there is a question box on the top of the screen, and I can already see there are some questions here. If you could just mention to whom you would like to direct the question to, that would be very helpful, so we can address it to the panelists directly. So let me see. There is. I'm just scanning the questions to see if we have anything for the panelists. Oh, there's one. So one question is, do you have any tools, methods used in the identification of biodiversity and ecosystem losses? This question has not been assigned to any particular panelist, but I can already see Julia raising her hand, so please feel free to come in.
Thanks, Rose. I'm glad we got this question, because it's sort of what it relates to what I was talking about before on the need to have data. And of course, you can only collect data and proper analyze and monitor once you have certain methodologies for that could be then scaled to countries' contexts. And in this regard, UNEP-CCC has been developing a loss and damage cost assessment tool to also help and support a more close to reality understanding of the cost of inaction and the cost related to climate impacts. This tool will have a sectoral component, which will obviously include the NELD aspect, both going into human health, but also going into biodiversity loss and loss of cultural heritage and different aspects that are often not captured, which is also what Elisa mentioned in her earlier point to the panel. And so this tool will be released in the middle of the year, so around June. We have validated it across 2 project sites at Zambia and Mauritius, as I mentioned. So they've been designed as part of this project, which is funded by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we have this project on addressing loss and damage and monitoring loss and damage. So I'll be happy to promote this and of course share it with colleagues from FEBA and PEDRR, so it can be scaled and also used by other experts. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, Aldrin, please come in.
Thanks. So someone pinged me a question and asked me to explain a bit more. Incidentally, when we developed the Green Assessment Recovery Framework, we were also simultaneously developing a natural capital accounting toolkit and therefore measuring nature. It just so happened that a super typhoon crossed our path, and that was an opportunity to test um, the different methodologies or metrics that we use to measure, to establish natural capital accounts in the Philippines, from ecosystem services, from regulating ecosystem services, provisioning ecosystem services, and cultural services. And alongside that, looking at the condition accounts on the condition of species and the condition and extent of ecosystems, whereby your natural capital would be measured. So in effect, when we talk about non-economic loss and damage assessment in the Philippines, we actually also worked on um, figuring out how to calculate the economic value of the otherwise non-economic value. For example, we looked at the total damage of forest loss of 125,000 hectares. We computed against carbon emissions, which was equivalent to 118 million metric tons CO2e emitted in just one day or one evening. So something like that. And we did also look at computed impacts on tourism, the visual amenities, and also looked at crucial and critical resource that indigenous peoples depend on, the resin, and we looked at the damage and the loss because of the typhoon. And so these are published, and we'll send you the link for the published toolkit, and with a caveat that it applies to we've Philippinized it. We've applied the UNSEA framework and the high conservation value as framework, fused it, and contextualize it in a archipelagic and Philippine setting. So you're welcome to browse through the methodology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aldrin. I'll hand over to Julia, who has her hand raised. Please come in, Julia.
Sorry, Rose. I realize this is a legacy hand, but thanks anyways. I'll lower it.
I see no worries at all. Great. So over to the next question. I'll see. I guess most of the questions have been addressed already, right? Have
If
there
I
been any
may,
other questions?
yeah, I just wanted to have a quick follow-up to what Aldrin was saying just now, which I found super interesting. They're trying to give an estimate value, an economic value to something that is to an L, to a non-economic loss. What about you talk about tourism, you talk about forest loss. What about losses to sectors that are harder to measure, to quantify, like cultural losses, heritage losses, that kind of thing? Is this included in the toolkits at all?
We designed, because even the UNSEA is not very clear about those methodologies on putting an economic value to that. But we've developed some proxy proxy values or proxy estimates. It's also in the toolkit. However, having said that, that is one of the limitations of the work that we've done so far, because we were very precise and very robust on looking at the extent and condition of ecosystems before and after the disaster, and we were able to quantify, and the conversations that we had with communities and affected individuals or families were able to qualify. But the challenge remains, when you have, we just came back from the field in with Chawa, and one of the key realization is that right after a typhoon, a disaster like that, as we have, when you have, funeral ceremonies and stuff like that, when you have funeral services, we realize that that is more not that is more about celebrating or having that sort of communal or conversation with your family and kin, and neighbors about the disaster. Often this is not touched with a 1-meter pole. No one has tried to measure, quantify, or even qualify the impacts psychologically to communities, especially women and children, and senior citizens, on impacts of extreme weather events, let alone slow onset events. And so I think that that's another a frontier that needs to be explored, because to me that is one of the big sort of roadblocks for realizing that sort of dream of ours of transforming, the role of communities and women, for that matter, from being beneficiaries after a storm to active players and active transformers of of recovery and restoration, if you see what I mean. We've not um, we've not had a chance to get our heads around that sort of challenge, and how to capture information that's very soft, and that's for many natural scientists, it's they call some juju happening over there. But yeah, that is important. If we can crack that nut, that tough nut, then we can help transform that sort of victim, move the communities from a victim and beneficiary syndrome to active, co restorers, if you like, of affected ecosystems and ecosystem services. Does that make sense, Eva? Thank you.
Thank you, Aldrin, and also Eva for the interesting follow-up question. Seeing in the chat if there's another question. So there is one question from Nicole asking, could you please speak more about how the inclusion of community engagement and participation, or lack thereof, impacts the success of implementation? So this question hasn't been assigned to any specific panelist, so feel free to come in if you would like to address the question.
I'd like to give it a go, but also happy to share the answer with Aldrin and Elisa. Speaking again based on these projects that I was highlighting earlier in Zambia and in Mauritius, We've been very intentional about including local community perspectives, particularly on the NELD side. But not only that, also when looking into proper economic losses and damages. And it's a really good question, because of course, when you don't include local communities, you will have a very incomplete picture of what you're talking about, specifically when it comes on that intersection with ecosystem services. When we were in Mauritius last year for an in-country visit, we were intervening or having consultations with local communities, both in Port Louis, which is the capital of Mauritius, but also had the privilege of engaging with communities a little bit outside of that area. And it was really eye-opening, because they were unpacking just proper trauma. They've had a series of cyclones as well, and the last one being very deadly, and people still remember. It sits very closely in their minds and their hearts. There were a number of death casualties. And I spoke to one young woman, actually, who mentioned that whenever it starts raining more heavily, she can't quite cope, and she's calling her family nonstop. And she was at the time of the cyclone trapped in a hotel, which she mentioned was not one of the worst places to be. But she remembers the feeling of not knowing where everybody was and whether she could get out of there safely. How would she get home? Whether her family made it out okay. So that kind of experience and doesn't often get, as I mentioned before, translated into national data and into even a methodology for assessing loss and damage. So having the proper grounding on local experiences is super important. Another example from Mauritius is we had some consultations with a local coastal community. We were looking into potentially expanding or discussing how nature-based solutions could support the coastal line, expanding mangroves. And the local community obviously sees a lot of value in that, the provision of livelihoods, and just the buffer between that coastal area, the coastal community, and the sea when there are storm surges, etc. But it didn't quite serve them because they wanted to have access to the water. It seemed like a great idea, but it didn't serve the purpose that it needed to. So that was also an important validation, item for us. And of course, these are isolated anecdotes, but it just goes to show how important it is to ground the experiences and ground conversations around quantifying, addressing losses and damages in local context, in local feedback, and in local perspectives. That being said, if this process is not fully streamlined, it can easily become a box-ticking exercise, which is also not good. You host a big consultation, you hear people out, great, check, this is done. And this is not a best practice, and this will also not ultimately serve the greater good, neither of the local community nor of the ecosystem, and also would very much yield negative results when it comes to legitimizing and grounding a project in a local foundation, in a solid context that is reflecting the situation on the ground. So I think for us as practitioners, it's very important to make sure that this process is legitimate, it's consistent, and that it is not intuitive, that's not the word I'm looking for, but intentional, very intentional in its steps. So I'll stop here, hand it over to Aldrin or Elisa if they would like to also answer the question. Otherwise, over to you, Rose.
Oh, thanks, Julia. If I may add, I think the word that you might want to, you were looking for is authentic. We tend to, technicians, technocrats, and scientists. If people leave us to our own devices, we can over study the site without listening to A, nature, and B, to local knowledge. There's a tendency for us to, because of the limited funding opportunities and the funding window, um, we tend to try to accelerate things that, such as ecosystem restoration is a long game. It does not follow, an 18-month, 24-month, 36-month project cycle. And therefore, activities like plant 1 million trees or 1 billion trees in 3 days, 2 days often don't work. Yes, they're sexy, they're newsworthy or headline worthy, but often, and we've seen this in the Philippines, they don't work. What work in post disaster is when we try to listen to nature and observe what seems to work. Nature will heal itself. I think that the role of communities and us is to keep the threats at bay, to give nature a fighting chance to heal itself. And we've seen this local communities, because they're too entrenched with they're linked with nature. So it's so the bind is so strong that they can mimic what nature is doing. So maybe listen to them more as they listen to nature and assist nature to heal, um, uh, so that it becomes authentic. And um, we can, maybe this is a shout out to, at a global and maybe sub-global context. If technology and finances are made available, can we please make this easier for communities to access? Because often they're the last ones to get access to it, and before they get to access, they have to jump several hoops. Um, you know, they were the ones who have lost their hunting grounds, their resources, and now we're asking them to fill out intricate forms, do log frames, or do um, these technological or technocrat tools, as opposed to how can we help. And last story, when we were facilitating the crafting of the green recovery framework and the green recovery plan for the communities of affected areas, we were doing intricate math on the cost of even machetes and seedlings, etc. Clockwork. But then one of the elders from the tribe said, sorry, we don't have anything to contribute except us. How do you? But we can't see us in that spreadsheet, in that 1.2 billion pesos worth a cost to restore. They said, this is our ancestral land, and this is our life, but we can't see us in that spreadsheet of the green ecosystem restoration plan. But maybe this is something that we need to get a grip on, and change the narrative too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aldrin, for these powerful concluding remarks of today. If you allow me, I'd like to take 2 or 3 more minutes to conclude today's discussion. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for their contributions today and for sharing insights into their work, and for highlighting the complexity, challenges, and opportunities faced when driving actions to avert, minimize, and address biodiversity loss and damage approaches. Today, we heard from Aldrin about how science-based tools like the Green Assessment and Recovery Framework, GALF, offer practical tools in bridging the gap between environmental protection and humanitarian recovery in complex contexts, such as the Philippines. Julia highlighted the important role of technical and research institutions and the importance of grounding evidence in local perspectives. And Elisa is connecting these dots by showing us how XCOM Santiago Network and the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage provide a pathway from global frameworks to local actions. And as we look at the current policy landscape, 2026 is a year of operationalization. While today was about action, we cannot ignore the elephant in the room, which is finance, which has been mentioned a few times today. Questions such as, how do we pay for the restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems, or how do we channel billions into local ecosystem-based responses? These might also be addressed in our next webinar, which will be on policy and financing solutions in June, where we will explore a bit more about this topic. So stay tuned for more details and the registration links on the website and our social media channels. Once again, thank you so much to our speakers and also to our organizing team behind the scenes, Hannah and Eva, who have made this possible today, and to all of you for joining us and shaping this fruitful discussion. Every loss matters, but every action also counts. So see you in the next session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thanks, Hannah, Elisa, Aldrin. Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
colleagues.